Good morning, Klaus. How are you?
Good morning, Lourdes. I'm fine. You?
I'm okay. So thank you very much for giving me a bit of time. I know you're super busy. So thank you for, letting me have your voice here in your ear for this remote post. The first thing I have to ask you is what's remote?
Well, actually, that's a very good question because this term of remote interpreting or remote is being used as kind of a generic concept to refer to very different settings, basically where the interpreter is not located in the same room with both the speakers and the audience at the same time. Now, depending on the interpreter's individual reality, which can be very different, of course, as we know, one of us might be thinking of a public service assignment, for example, where he or she is delivering interpreting services for a medical consultation. But due to geographical reasons or also limited availability, either of the interpreter or the doctor or whoever it is, the interpreter can't be present where the consultation takes place. On the other hand, others might be thinking more of a kind of business meeting where during a normal presence-based meeting with participants and interpreters sitting in the same room, all of a sudden an additional speaker is connected from a distance. So meaning that you would have a kind of a video conference or web conference scenario. And if a classical conference interpreter, as I am, talks about remote, we might be thinking more of a multilingual conference between heads of state or whoever it is, where due to limited space, the interpreter's booth cannot be placed in the conference room, but need to be set up either in a room next door or in a different building in proximity or even several hundreds of thousands of miles away. So you can easily imagine that each of these settings needs to be addressed differently, not only in technical terms, which is basically what I'm studying quite a lot right now, but also in terms of qualification and training of interpreters and many other aspects.
So I suppose that's why we have these AIIC guidelines, to try to find a bit, to see how we can, organize all this. It has to be huge, so many things, right? Can
Yes,
you?
exactly. Yes. The guidelines actually go back to many questions we got from our colleagues, and SAIC and SAIC Task Force on Distance Interpreting, which has been created to be the focal point for these kind of things related to distance interpreting. We felt the strong need for giving guidance both to individual interpreters. But we also wanted to raise awareness amongst consultant interpreters, for example, amongst recruiters of interpreters, event and conference organizers, as well as developers and providers of technical equipment for distance interpreting. And this made us think of at least starting a process where we give information on the basic aspects, making or giving people the possibility to really understand better what it is about and what the technical aspects are on the one hand, but also everything else that is related to working from a distance.
I've read the guidelines, but can you, summarize a bit, the most important things, shortly? Could you,
Yes, I can do that. First of all, I need to repeat because some people, I guess, don't know, those who have not read the guidelines, that we chose only a very, let's say, specific setting when we drafted those guidelines. We did not want to cover, for example, interpreter-mediated events without transmission of images of the speaker and or the audience to the interpreter, such as telephone calls or audio conferences. We did that for a very specific reason. We are a conference interpreters association, and therefore the majority of us that work in conference interpreting settings always have that visual input, and we feel the strong need for having that visual input. We know that you can, of course, deliver your services without having the visual input, but it's always something different, and we feel the strong need for having this, basically. On the other hand, these guidelines specifically focus on the working conditions for video remote conference interpreting in simultaneous mode. So we are not talking about consecutive mode or semi-consecutive bilateral conversations, these kind of settings, but we really wanted to address what the majority of us is still doing nowadays, which is a real conference interpreting setting in simultaneous mode, but with video input, of course. And then we thought about what to include in these guidelines. We thought it would be necessary to say something about the location where this conference interpreting is happening. We started from thinking that this is still a team effort. We felt a strong need for addressing these as a team effort and not going for individual delivery of the services. And therefore, we included something about working in a team, at least within the same booth, even if it's a virtual booth, but the people sitting together. And then we also have some information in the guidelines on what the location where the interpreters are working from needs to be compliant with in technical terms. In terms of how does the room have to look like, for example, what are the basic conditions in order to be able to deliver that services, not only for half an hour, but maybe for even 6, 7, or 8 hours, as the normal duration of a conference could be. Then we also included some maybe minor things, but that are important nowadays when we work in a traditional booth with furniture, with tables, with having everything there that we need in order to deliver our services. Things like access to documents during the conference, for example. We also address this. And you can easily imagine that when you're not in the same room and there is no one who can just hand you in the documents into your booth, this needs to be solved in another way.
Yeah.
But it's actually necessary to have this access. One very big topic was also confidentiality and data protection. Especially in Europe, as we have, let's say, a legal system that forces us to think about these confidentiality and data protection topics and aspects. This is also something that when it comes to remote, immediately gets a very different dimension. You have to handle this. So there you will find some information on this as well, including also recording and web streaming, which by nature is something imminent to remote. Communication between the different stakeholders during an event is also something that seemed important to us, be it the interpreter with a technician. If something is happening with your interface, for example, and you don't know how to solve it, you need to have someone there who can help you out. You need to be able to communicate with the one that is responsible for the event. Let's call him the event moderator. Asking, for example, for documentation, asking for, telling the speaker that he's maybe speaking too fast and that he needs to slow down. So actually, all the things that usually we have in a direct communication between the different booths and between the other people that are around us needs to be in place also when it comes to remote. Then the view we would have on the speaker and also the documents that are shown to the audience, this needs to be available for the interpreters as well. If we are sitting in a presence-based scenario, we would have a direct view on the screen, for example, or at least we would have some additional screens in our booth that would give us this visual input. And in a remote setting, this also needs to be there and available for the interpreters. Then in the end, of course, as I'm very much into this technical thing, I wanted to have in the guidelines also some basic information on what the basic parameters are in terms of audio quality, like frequency response, like, for example, latency. So these kind of things that are always a topic also in a presence-based scenario, but with remote, these get a slightly different dimension. Not to forget things like protection of the ears, of the hearing of the interpreters. We had some very serious incidents in Canada, unfortunately, and therefore
what kind of incidents? What happened?
Well, actually, what happened is that during remote interpreting, someone must have, most probably, switched off or disconnected a device from one of the components of the equipment in place at one of the connected points, and reconnected it again. And this, in the end, meant that there was a very heavy impulse coming through the system. And as there were no hearing protection measures in place, it directly came to the ears of the interpreters. And unfortunately, they had to go to hospital. And these kind of things, we need to avoid them, of course. So we need to have acoustic shock protection in place, either at every connected point, which would be the ideal situation. So this wouldn't happen anyway. It wouldn't come through the system. But as we can't be sure that this doesn't happen, we at least recommend that interpreters make use of specific devices that you can connect between your headset and your laptop, if that's the interface, in order to be you the one that really is in control of having that hearing protection on your side, at your end. Yeah, so there are quite different topics that are covered in the guidelines, but actually it's important to know these are guidelines. This is not a technical specification or not an ISO standard or whatever. These are guidelines, and it's the first version, and we want to raise awareness in the first place and give some guidance when it comes to remote. That was the main idea.
And tell me, Klaus, nowadays, what are the main problems and challenges with remote? What's going on? Because, I mean, you say it's guidelines, you are starting this way, but nowadays, what are the big problems and challenges for interpreters with remote?
Well, actually, I think one of the biggest challenges we have is to overcome our usual practice. Maybe it is difficult for us that have been working, at least my generation, that has been working in a traditional setting for 30 years now, to understand that things have changed all around us. Society has changed.
Yes.
The demand for communication in our society has changed. The way that events are being set up nowadays has changed. So I think we can't be the only ones that say everything needs to be the same as 30 years ago. It's very difficult to hold up this position. So the challenge is to, first of all, understand what is happening there. What does it mean? How does it feel like? And then find the appropriate way of dealing with it. It's not completely different from the presence-based interpreting. But there are some differences, of course, that need to be addressed. And I think we as interpreters community should simply get prepared for that future, because it's not even a future, it's a reality. It is there. In many countries, it's being used on a daily basis already since a couple of years. So I think it's time simply to catch up and to be us the ones that also have an influence on the developments that are taking place.
Okay, so you think we have to somehow adapt, and we have to react, and we have to try to influence, what's going on, right?
Yes, I think the last thing that you mentioned, the influence, is very important. If we really want to raise our voice, if we really want to get heard, if we really want to change maybe some of the things that are happening on the market right now, because basically it's technology driven, the situation as we have it right now. There were some providers that simply saw this as a business model and that thought that the technologies were there which have they are there on the market, and that simply went for it. And now I think it's on us to really have an influence on the future development of these solutions and making them as appropriate as possible to suit our own needs.
So I think add the human side to it, right? Exactly. Professionals, you know, the person, the people, not just the machines doing the job.
Exactly.
And do you think...
So aspect, yes.
Do you think things are going to change more? I mean, this is just the beginning of, you know, a trend that things are going to, you know, to get into remote and more complicated. And how do you see the future?
Well, actually, if I would have the magic crystal ball to show me exactly what the future will bring us, it would be easier for me. But as I said before, I do realize that all around us, society has been changing.
Yeah.
The way people communicate has been changing. And the developments, especially in the technological field, are happening much faster nowadays than it used to be 30, 40, or 50 years ago.
True.
And therefore, I think as interpreters, we need to face that reality and try to identify the most relevant parameters that might be determining the future of our profession. We should have a look at what could society look like in the year 2030, for example, and then us being the ones that drive some of these developments from our side. It also has to do something with, let's say, maintaining that profession as a profession, preventing this from being only, let's say, a commodity, and really giving it the value it has. I think we are all aware of the fact that in the traditional interpreting world, things have been changing quite a lot in the past years. And therefore, I even see quite some opportunities in this different approach now. We are forced to addressing it, but I think this also gives us the opportunity for coming back to some of the most basic fundamentals of our profession, which are things like, for example, quality. What about quality?
True.
In a remote setting, quality, or there are more people that have access to these events and that can evaluate the quality of the service that it would be if everyone was sitting in the same room only. So there are quite some opportunities there, and my personal opinion is we should simply have a look at the future and not always look back. We need to look back as well. Yes, history is very important, and we've seen some developments in our profession in the last decades, which are very important for us. But we also need to look ahead and see where does society go to, and where do we find our place to suit the needs of society, communication in society in the future.
And if we talk about penetration in different markets, is it the same trend everywhere? Is it more in, you know, the States or Europe? How are the different markets when we talk about remote? Is it, you know, developing the same way, or is it changing?
I think we have very different penetration of what remote is. If you have a look at the United States and Canada, they've been working on remote for a couple of years already. So it's nothing new to them. But basically, it was made over the phone. And then they were more and more using, let's say, the web conferencing tools that are out there on the market, which never have been developed for multilingual communication, but only for a direct communication between people speaking the same language. But it is there, and there is a huge penetration of remote in some settings. For example, in the healthcare segment, the whole healthcare system in the United States depends largely on remote interpreting. You have a lot of different cultures there. You have a lot of different languages that are being spoken. And in order to give access to services, to healthcare services, this sometimes is the only way due to the geographical conditions we have in such a big country, but also due to the multicultural society you find there. In Europe, we also have some differences between the different countries. In Great Britain, for example, remote is already being used in certain settings, specifically in public service interpreting. But there are other countries where this is not really either well accepted or possible. If you have a look at some Arab countries or African countries, for the simple fact that you have a very low connectivity in some areas, in some geographical areas, it's quite difficult to make it happen. If you have a very poor connection, you can do whatever you want, but you will never achieve a real good communication on remote. So there are big differences between different regions, between different market segments, and it's quite interesting to see what is happening right now, and these developments are going on very fastly, as I said before, and we will see what happens.
When you talk about not well accepted, don't you think that maybe you find interpreters, professional interpreters, who do not want to work with remote, but you can always find other interpreters who wanted to do the job? Don't you think that this acceptance is not important because you can always find someone who wanted to do the job? Do you think there's a dumping there?
Yes and no. I think you're right in saying that you will always find someone who will be willing to accept an assignment, be it on remote or be in presence-based scenario, just the same. But on remote, what makes the difference is that you immediately move yourself in an international context. So you're not competing anymore with interpreters in your own regional, local market, but there is immediately a competition amongst all the different markets. And there are companies who simply try to source interpreters at the best price they can find on the market, and they will always find someone who does it for less. That's reality as well. But again, I mean, these are things that you should at least have the choice. That's my personal opinion, to go for it or to say, no, this I simply don't want this. I will limit myself to do what I've been doing the last decades, or what I've been taught at university, for example. And you have to be aware of the fact that this will exclude you from some market segments.
New markets,
You should have the choice, I guess. And I perfectly understand if colleagues say, I don't want this. But I also understand if especially the younger generation says, hey, it's about our future.
Exactly.
We need to adapt. We need to find the way of how to maintain this profession also in the future. And if this is one of the possibilities, then let's just do it and help us. You, the ones that have the experience, help us in doing so.
With good conditions, but why not, try to work in remote in a decent way, It could be done, sure, it could.
Of course.
You were talking about new opportunities with this, with the remote interpretation, communication, quality, and all that. Do you think that a professional interpreter today, could get more work with remote then? Because there are some people say, no, it's just, this is the end of the profession. But you think that professional interpreters can get more work this way or not?
Yes. I think that there is quite a huge potential for remote to become kind of a complementary business, something additional to what we have right now. For example, attending meetings that until now were simply not done with interpreters.
Exactly.
For financial, logistic, or time reasons. As you mentioned when we talked before the interview, you mentioned Greece. Greece is a country that, due to its geographical situation, with a lot of different islands, with quite a difficult access to those islands, you simply can't set up a booth from one day to another in a conference venue or whatever. So you need to find a different solution. On the other hand, there will always be some smaller meetings maybe that, as I said before, until now were never served with interpreting services, and that now might have access to multilingual communication.
Mm-hmm.
Even if we know that there are a lot of companies that try to eliminate multilingual communication and reducing it all to only English or only German or whatever it might be. But I do think that there is quite a huge potential, and I can also imagine, and in fact I know that from some of my own clients, that companies and organizations are adopting, let's say, new formats for their own events, decentralized formats with everyone participating from different parts of the world, which immediately brings us in a situation as interpreters to think about where is our place in that maybe different scenario. Yeah? The whole MICE industry is changing quite a lot. And if you see what happens there, I think there are quite a lot of opportunities to get more work than we have right now. Which does not mean that I'm not aware of the fact that if someone only looks at remote from an economic point of view, there might be people thinking, oh, that's the best way for cutting down costs. And I simply don't care where the interpreters are located. I simply don't want to spend a lot of money on the interpreting, and it's much cheaper if I do that on remote. This might happen, and this might... there might be some kind of cannibalism from the remote segment to the traditional conference interpreting segment. But I don't think that this will become too important. There will always be enough people, enough companies, enough organizations that on purpose want to have everyone on site, that want to give the people the possibility of communicating with each other, not only during the main conference program, but also during breaks in the evenings, in small breakout sessions and things like that. And therefore, interpreters will have to be on site there to facilitate interpreting in these scenarios. So I think there is a huge potential for getting more work. But during a certain time, at least, there will also be some effects that will be reducing our traditional work. And we simply have to see how can we compensate for this and what are these new opportunities that will bring us an additional market volume.
Mm-hmm. One last question. International organizations, do you think they are going to be the driving force in this?
Difficult to say. We know that there are already now some international organizations, Amnesty International, for example, who use remote, I would say on a daily basis for webinars, but also for their staff being connected from different points of the world for shorter meetings. There are also some UN agencies that already have worked with RSI platforms. If you, on the other side, have a look at the EU institutions, they are studying possibilities and technologies for multilingual conferences only now. And we will have to wait and see whether remote is something they think can be an appropriate technology from an economic point of view, but also from a very practical point of view. So yes, they might be a driving force once they go for it, and once they see that this can be a solution for some of their needs, and once they are able also to find a solution for how to handle, for example, staff interpreters, which of course will need a completely different regime. You will have to organize this work in a completely different way, and this will take some time. Knowing how slowly things develop in big companies and in big organizations, I think this will take some time until we will see that on a large scale. But definitely everyone is there studying the possibilities, which is good in my opinion to do that, and trying to identify the use cases.
Okay, so then remote is not the apocalypse, right?
I don't think so.
Me
and
neither.
if
Me
it is,
neither.
it would take us all away at the same
Yeah.
time. So I don't think so. I don't think so. We have seen though these kind of changes already back in the 40s, for example, when we had the change from consecutive interpreting, which was basically what we were doing as conference interpreters. Not myself, but the other
Yeah, I imagine.
the generation for us. And they thought that simultaneous would kill the profession. And we are at this basically at the same stage again now. So it is something different, yes, and we need to identify the basic parameters that determine our work and what we really need for making this happen. But I don't think it's something that should only threaten us. There are a lot of opportunities in it, and I personally prefer to look at the future and not to look too much back, without saying that let's say the history and the very core of our profession doesn't need to be maintained as such. It does. We can't change everything from one day to another, but we need to go with the time, I think.
Yeah, I agree with you, Klaus. I think you're right. I think the future's there, and we have to look ahead, not look so much backwards. Well, thank you very much. A pleasure. Very interesting again. And well, I hope to see you in Barcelona sooner or later. And yeah, we can talk more about remote. So thank you very much, Klaus. And I'm sure all the followers from A Word in Your Ear will be very happy with this interview. So
thank you very much for giving me this opportunity, and hope to see you soon somewhere else. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Bye.
Bye.